She looked at the document for a long time. Not reading it, she had read it twice already, had parsed every clause and understood every word and felt the full weight of what each line represented. She was not looking at it to understand it. She was looking at it the way you look at a thing when you are deciding what it means to you rather than what it says, the difference between the legal fact of freedom and the lived question of what you do when it is finally, actually, yours. The room was quiet. Dante was at the window. His back to her, his hands in his pockets. The city behind the glass going about its amber indifferent business in the way it always did, in the way it had through every version of everything that had happened in this house. The city did not care. The city had never cared. It simply continued, the way cities do, while the people inside the buildings made the decisions that would define whatever came next. She thought about her father's kitchen. The coat and the cigarettes and the floor he couldn't look up from. The words he had said and the relief that had lived underneath them. That was the thing she had not let herself look at directly until Dante put it on the desk in the study and required her to. The relief. Her father placing her on the table not in desperation but in the particular exhale of a man setting down something he had always found too heavy to carry. She had been weight to him. Obligation. The living evidence of a life he had not chosen well enough. She thought about what it meant that the first man to treat her as something worth protecting, worth dissolving a debt over, worth signing a document for, worth standing at a window with his back turned and his hands in his pockets in the posture of a man who has opened his hand and is waiting to see what flies and what stays, was a man the city whispered about in lowered voices. She thought about his palm over hers in the car. The heartbeat that hadn't steadied. Her name set into her hair in the dark outside a building where someone had just tried to kill him, said not as a command, not as a claim, but as the sound a man makes when he looks directly at a world without something in it and finds the view unbearable. She picked up the document. She looked at it one final time, at his signature at the bottom, dark and deliberate, the physical expression of the hardest thing in his vocabulary. The man who possessed everything, learning to open his hand. She set it down on the desk. Not torn. Not rejected. Simply set aside, placed with the same deliberate care he had used when he handed it to her, returned to the surface it came from without ceremony, without announcement, without a word spoken because the gesture was the word and the word did not need translation. Dante heard the paper meet the desk. She watched his shoulders, the ones she had learned to read the way sailors read weather, the ones that carried everything his face refused to show. She watched them receive the sound of the document being set down and she watched something move through them that started at the base of his neck and went all the way down. He turned around. He looked at her across the room, at her face, her hands, the document on the desk beside her, and what was in his expression was not the fortress and not the recalibration and not the careful management of distance. It was simply him. The man underneath the empire, standing in the amber light of his own study, looking at a woman who had just chosen to stay inside an open door. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already visible in the space between them, in the unsigned document and the turned back and the hand that had been opened and the woman who had, freely and completely and with full knowledge of what it cost, decided to remain. He crossed the room. Not to reach for her. Not yet, not here, that was not what this moment was. He crossed the room and stood close and looked at her face with the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the presence of another person beside the weight of it feels like something he does not yet have a word for. She looked back at him. Outside the city breathed its amber breath and the gates held and the stone walls continued and the estate contained them both in its serious amber silence and for one night, one single night, the first either of them had known in longer than they could honestly account for, there was nothing required of either of them except to be exactly where they were. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The morning came in quietly, the way mornings do after nights that have changed everything, indifferent to what the darkness contained, offering light without commentary. Arya had slept. Actually slept, for the first time since the estate had become her world, the particular deep sleep of a body that has finally been permitted to put something down. She was in the kitchen when the intercom crackled. Not the main gate intercom, the private line, the one that bypassed the outer staff and rang directly to the small panel mounted beside the study door. She had noticed it in her first week. Had catalogued it the way she catalogued everything. Filed under, direct access, trusted source, used rarely. In the weeks since she had heard it ring twice. Both times Dante had answered before the second tone and whatever was said had been brief and private and had not been repeated in her presence. This time it rang 4 times before he moved. She heard him cross the hall. Heard the brief silence of the channel opening. And then she heard nothing. No response, no acknowledgement, none of the clipped efficiency he applied to every communication she had witnessed. Just silence on his end, which was the loudest thing she had ever heard him produce. She set down her coffee. He appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. Dark shirt, the morning version of him that she had learned over weeks. Less fortress than the suited version, more human, the edges of him slightly less managed at this hour. He looked at her and his face was doing something she had never seen it do. Not recalibrating. Not filing and processing and arriving at a controlled response. Simply struck. The way a person looks when something reaches them below all the levels they have built to prevent exactly that. He said, "I need to deal with something." Nothing else. No explanation, no instruction, no request for her to remain where she was or do anything in particular. He simply said it and left the room, and she heard his footsteps on the marble going toward the front of the estate and then the heavy sound of the main door. She waited exactly 45 seconds. Then she went to the corridor window. The car was already on the driveway, a dark sedan, not one she recognized from the estate's regular rotation, moving at the unhurried pace of something that had every right to be exactly where it was. It stopped at the base of the front steps. The driver's door opened and closed without interest. Then the passenger door. The woman who stepped out was not young, or not only young, which was different. She was the age of someone who had passed through something and come out the other side of it carrying what the passage had made her, and the carrying had given her a quality that had nothing to do with years. She was dressed in dark, simple clothing. Her hair was dark. Her posture was. Aria's hand went flat against the cold window glass without her deciding to move it. Her posture was upright. Not rigidly. Not performatively. Simply upright in the way of someone who had decided, at some point during whatever it was they had survived, that their spine was the one thing that belonged entirely to them and they would not negotiate it away for anyone or anything. Arms loose at her sides. Chin level. The particular composed stillness of a woman who had learned to walk into difficult situations on her own feet because it was the only advantage available. Arya had learned that walk in a kitchen at midnight. She recognized it the way you recognize a language your body speaks before your mind does. Immediately, completely, with the specific vertigo of seeing something you thought was only yours reflected back at you from the outside. Dante was at the top of the steps. She watched him from above, his back to her, the set of his shoulders doing the thing they had done in the study when he talked about Lucia, the thing she had learned to read as the body carrying what the face refused to show. He stood at the top of the steps and the woman stood at the bottom, and the distance between them was not the distance of strangers. It was the distance of a very specific history. The kind measured not in space but in everything that had been said and done and left unsaid and undone across a span of time that predated Aria's presence in this house by years. The woman looked up at him. Then, as though she felt the weight of observation from above, she looked up further, past him, past the steps, up to the corridor window where a blonde woman in dark clothing stood with her palm flat against the glass. Their eyes met. Neither of them looked away. And in the 3 seconds of that held gaze Arya understood, with the particular cold clarity that had kept her alive in rooms full of dangerous people since she was old enough to read them, that this woman was not an enemy, was not a threat in the way she had been trained to identify threats, was not something Dante had sent for or invited or arranged. She was something that had simply returned. And the look in her eyes was not triumph, not possession, not the declaration of prior claim. It was recognition. The same recognition Arya had seen in her own mirror on the mornings after the conversations that had cost her something real, the face of a woman who has survived a particular man's particular gravity and is still, despite everything, inside it. Arya took her hand off the glass. She stepped back from the window. And she stood in the corridor of Dante Ricci's estate, the document ensigned on the desk behind her, her freedom intact, the morning light coming through the glass with its usual indifference, and she breathed, carefully, through the specific sensation of a world she had just started to understand rearranging itself into something she had not yet been given the map for. Below, the front door opened. Footsteps on marble. The estate received its guest the way it received everything, in amber silence, without comment, the stone and the wood and the sconces holding steady while the people inside them became, once again, something new. She found him in the study. Not because she had followed him. She had given him 20 minutes, had stood in the corridor after stepping back from the window and counted her own breathing and waited until the counting felt less like survival and more like choice. Then she had walked to the study the way she had walked into his estate on the first night, on her own feet at her own pace, because it was the only advantage available and she intended to use it. He was at the desk. Not seated, standing behind it, one hand flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has just run out of the particular kind of courage it takes to keep a specific thing unspoken. She had seen versions of that expression before. On her father's face in the kitchen, the night the words finally came out. On Dante's own face in this same room, when he had talked about Lucia for the first time. But this was different. This was not the face of someone preparing to speak. This was the face of someone who had already decided and was simply waiting for the room to be ready. She closed the door behind her. She did not sit. She stood in the center of the room with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and she looked at him across the desk, and she said nothing, because she had learned, in the weeks of living inside his silences, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could offer a person was the space to begin. He began. Her name was Valentina Caruso before she became Valentina Ricci. He said this the way he said things that mattered, without preamble, without the performance of difficulty, simply stating the first fact and letting it exist before moving to the next one. They had married 6 years ago. Quietly. A ceremony with 12 people present, in a room smaller than this study, because Dante had understood even then that the things he cared about most needed to be kept away from the version of himself the city knew. She had understood what she was marrying. He said this clearly, with neither pride nor apology. Valentina had not been deceived about his world, had not been a civilian who discovered too late what the man beside her actually was. She had grown up adjacent to this life the way Arya had grown up adjacent to her father's, knowing the language underneath the language, reading rooms, understanding that certain silences were louder than words. They had been, for 2 years, something that worked. He did not say happy. Arya noticed that he did not say happy. He said something that worked, and she understood the distinction. The difference between happiness, which required a kind of openness he had not yet learned, and functionality, which was what two careful people could build together when they were both fluent in survival. Then the child came. He stopped for a moment when he said this. Not long, 2 seconds, 3, the pause of someone crossing a threshold they have not crossed in a long time. A boy. Dark hair, dark eyes, the particular combination of his father's jaw and his mother's stillness that had produced something Dante had not been prepared for and had not known how to carry without holding too tightly. He had held too tightly. He said this without being asked, which cost him something she could see. He said it the way people say true things about themselves that they have spent years avoiding, flatly, precisely, without the softening that would have made it easier to hear but less honest. He had held too tightly. Had surrounded them both, Valentina and the boy, with the same architecture he had built around everything he could not afford to lose. Walls. Guards. Controlled access. The logic of possession applied to love, which was the only logic he had known since he was 14 years old and learned in the most catastrophic way available what happened to the things you failed to protect. Valentina had told him in the second year that she was suffocating. He had responded by adding another layer of security to the perimeter. She had left 3 months later. Had taken the boy, whose name he still did not say and Arya still did not push, and had disappeared into a protection arrangement that Dante himself had designed and funded, because even in the wreckage of understanding that she was right to go, the only thing he knew how to do was make sure she was safe. He had been making sure she was safe for 2 years. Not through contact. They had agreed on near silence, the occasional encrypted communication through an intermediary, nothing that could surface their location and anything a rival faction could access. The divorce he could not file. Not because he refused, he said this looking directly at her and she believed him, but because divorce proceedings required documentation, and documentation created trails, and trails led to a woman and a child he had spent 2 years keeping invisible to the men who would use them the way Marco had tried to use Arya. As leverage. As a message. As the most efficient way to reach the thing Dante Ricci had buried deepest. He had chosen their safety over his own freedom. He had not told Arya because he stopped here. Looked at his hand on the desk. The scarred one. Then back at her. He had not told her because telling her would have required him to admit that he was capable of a love that gave things up rather than acquired them. That somewhere underneath the possession and the architecture and the walls there was a version of him that had learned, too late at too high a cost, that the people you love most are not made safer by being held. They are made safer by being free. And admitting that to Arya, who had arrived at his door in silence and lifted her chin and refused to be anything other than entirely herself, would have meant admitting that he already knew from the beginning, that possession was the wrong language for what she was. He had known. He had done it anyway. Because it was the only language he had. He finished speaking. The study held the silence the way it always held things, without comment, without resolution, the dark wood and the amber light and the shelves of books simply present around the truth that had just been placed in the center of the room like an object too heavy to move. He did not ask for her understanding. He did not reach for her, did not lean forward, did not deploy any of the tools she had watched him use across weeks of careful navigation. He simply stood behind the desk with his hand flat on the surface and his face unmanaged, and the full truth of him finally, completely, without remainder, in the open air between them. Waiting. Not managing the outcome for the first time in longer than either of them could measure. She looked at him across the desk and the document and the weeks and the photograph with the worn corners and the corridor at 11 at night and his palm over hers in the dark car and her name set into her hair in the chaos outside a building where someone had tried to end him. She looked at all of it. She did not speak yet. But she did not leave. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Not because she was searching for words. She had the words, had known them since she stepped back from the corridor window with her hand leaving a print on the cold glass and the image of Valentina Ricci's posture burning itself into the back of her mind with the particular permanence of things that reorder everything you thought you understood. The words had been there the whole time. She had simply been deciding whether they deserved to be spoken aloud or whether the situation was the kind that swallowed questions whole and gave nothing back. She decided they deserved to be spoken. She looked at him across the desk, at the emptied face, the open hand, the man who had just placed everything he was onto a surface and stepped back from it without asking her to be careful with it, and she asked the only question that mattered. Did what happened between us cost you nothing, she said, because you were never truly free to give it? She said it the way she said things that mattered, level, unhurried, without the performance of pain even though the pain was present, real and specific and located somewhere below her sternum where the things she didn't display lived alongside everything else she had learned to carry quietly. She was not asking to wound him. She was asking because she was Aria Moretti and she had grown up in the language underneath the language and she needed to know whether the things she had felt in this house, the things she had set a document aside for, the things she had chosen at the cost of the only freedom she had ever been handed, had been real on both sides or whether she had simply been the next warm thing in the vicinity of a man whose wife had left and whose house had gotten very cold. She needed to know if she was a choice or a substitution. Dante looked at her. He was quiet for a long time. Not the managed quiet, not the silence he deployed as a demonstration, the unhurried pause of a man who had learned that making people wait was its own kind of power. This was different. This was the quiet of someone doing something genuine and difficult in real time, in front of another person without the option of privacy. Working through something at the foundation level, below the place where language lived, trying to locate the most honest version of an answer to a question that deserved nothing less. She knew that child. Not personally. In the way that mattered. Dante was already moving, to the door, to the operational version of himself that she had watched from a corridor window in the early weeks of her time here, the version that made decisions at the speed of reflex and executed them with the terrible economy of long practice. He was pulling on his jacket, his phone already in his hand, the fortress reassembling itself around him with the practiced speed of a man who had worn it for so long that putting it back on required no more thought than breathing. He stopped at the door, turned back, looked at her, at the document on the desk, at her face, at the window behind her where the city continued its amber indifference. The look of a man who has just opened himself completely and is now being required, by the specific nature of his life and what it costs, to close again before the opening has had time to mean anything in the daylight. You should go, he said. Not a command. The opposite of a command, the most genuine thing he had said to her outside of 4 words 11 minutes ago. Take the document. Take the car. I'll have someone drive you wherever. Where is Valentina? Aria said. He stopped. East Wing, he said carefully. Second room. Why? She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the document on the desk. The full legal architecture of her freedom sitting between them and signed, every clause intact, the dissolved debt and the open gate and the life outside these walls still available, still waiting, still entirely hers to claim whenever she decided to reach for it. She left it on the desk. She walked to the door. She stopped beside him in the doorway, close, the same distance as the first night in the entry hall, closer than polite and farther than threatening, and she looked up at him with the light blue-gray eyes that had not flinched since the night she arrived and she said, "We deal with the child first." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that she had not seen there before, not in the entry hall, not in the study with the photograph, not in the car with his palm over hers, not outside the building with his face in her hair. Not in any of the versions of him she had catalogued across the weeks of learning to read the architecture of a man who had made himself into a fortress. She held his gaze. Then you and I, she said, are going to have a very different conversation. What happened in his face in the silence that followed was not recalibration. It was not the chess player adjusting the board, not the measured processing of new information, not the controlled management of distance that had been his primary language for longer than either of them had been sharing the same rooms. It was not the fortress. It was not the empire. It was not any of the things the city whispered about when it lowered its voice and said his name. It was something that had no armor around it at all. Something that lived beneath every wall he had ever built and every decision he had ever made and every version of himself he had ever constructed to ensure that the things he could not afford to lose would never be found by anyone with the means or the motive to use them. Something that had been there since before Lucia and before Valentina and before the photograph with the worn corners and before the morning he was 14 years old and learned what the world did to the soft parts of you if you left them visible. It was the face of a man who has spent the better part of his life making sure no one could reach the thing inside him that could still be reached, and who is standing in a doorway watching a woman choose, freely, with full knowledge of everything it costs and everything it complicates and everything it does not yet resolve, to walk deeper into his world rather than out of it. Not for him. She had said not yet and he had heard it and he understood the distinction completely, had understood it in the way that only someone who had spent years confusing possession with love could understand the difference between a woman who stays because she has nowhere else to go and a woman who stays because she has decided that this specific situation, this specific child, this specific complicated wreckage of a morning requires her particular brand of composure and clear-eyed capability and she is the one in the room who has it. She was staying because of who she was, not because of who he was. And that was the thing that reached him below every level he had constructed to prevent exactly this. Because possession he understood. Acquisition he understood. The logic of people staying because the alternative was worse he understood completely and had relied on his entire adult life. He had never had someone stay because of their own character. He had never had someone make him incidental to their own integrity. He looked at her in the doorway, fair skin, blonde hair, light blue-gray eyes already moving past him toward the East Wing and Valentina and whatever the next hour required of her, and he felt the full specific weight of what she was and what he had almost let walk out of this house with a signed document and a car and his own guilt masquerading as generosity. He let her pass. She moved down the corridor without looking back. The upright posture, the arms loose, the particular quality of forward motion that had nothing to do with where she was going and everything to do with who was doing the going. She had walked into his estate on her own feet 6 weeks ago and she was walking through it now the same way, and the estate, the stone and the marble and the amber light, received her the way it had always received her, not as a guest, not as a captive, but as a fixed point. Someone the house had arranged itself around without being asked. He watched her until she turned the corner. Then he looked at the study behind him, the document on the desk, the window, the 2 coffee cups from this morning still on the table by the chair where she had been sitting when the intercom first rang and everything changed. He looked at all of it. And the question that lived in the amber light of that room, the one that had been building since a midnight phone call and a woman who arrived in silence and lifted her chin and told him she didn't follow rules she hadn't agreed to, was no longer the question it had started as. It was no longer whether she would stay. It was what staying was going to cost them both. Whether the thing being built here, in the wreckage of a marriage and a betrayal and a bullet taken and a document and signed and 4 words said and meant completely, was the kind of structure that broke under the weight of its own foundation. Or the kind that held. The kind that held not because it had been built carefully, not because the people inside it had made wise choices or clean ones or choices without consequence, but because the materials were true. Because 2 people who had both learned, at significant personal cost, that the world required you to become harder than you wanted to be had found in each other the specific and terrifying thing that made the hardness unnecessary. That question had no answer yet. It would be answered in the living of it. In the East Wing where Valentina was waiting and the child was in danger and a woman who had every legal right to be somewhere else entirely was walking toward the problem because that was simply who she was. It would be answered in the conversation that came after. In all the conversations that came after. Dante Ricci stood in the doorway of his study in the amber morning light of a house that had been his alone for 8 years, and he breathed, carefully, fully, the way a man breathes when he has just understood something that changes the nature of everything before it without erasing any of it. Then he straightened his jacket. And he went to do what he had always done, protect the things that mattered at whatever cost the protecting required, except that this time, for the first time, the thing that mattered most was not something he had acquired or contained or surrounded with walls. It was something that had chosen freely to be here. And the difference between those 2 things was the distance between the man he had been and the man he was, in this corridor, in this light, on this morning. He was not sure yet what that man looked like from the outside. He was beginning to understand what he felt like from within. The corridor was empty. The estate held its amber breath. Somewhere in the East Wing a door opened and closed. Her footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, the sound of someone who had decided and was now simply doing, and Dante Ricci, the most feared man in the city, stood in the hall of his own house and listened to the sound of a woman who had been handed her freedom and set it on his desk and walked away from it toward a child she had never met. He listened until the sound was gone. Then he moved.